Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining Witham today. We have a great presentation in store for you all. Before we begin, I just have a few housekeeping items to cover. First, you will all be on mute during the presentation. However, at the bottom of the toolbar, you will see a chat box. We encourage you to ask questions during the session, which our speakers will answer at the end of their presentation. And this session will also be recorded for future reference, and a link to it will be provided to all attendees. Feel free to share additional thoughts or input after the webinar has wrapped up as well, as your feedback is greatly appreciated. With that, I am going to turn it over to Bill Sansone, partner and practice leader of Witham's Law Firm Advisory Team.
Thank you, Alexis. So welcome, everybody. I think you're all in for a nice little treat, especially if you're trying to get your latest update regarding, cyber threats. I think we're lucky to have Ed Tech here as our speaker. Ed knows a lot of stuff, and I think you'll be I think you'll be surprised by some of the things he's going to tell you, that maybe some things that you haven't heard before. And I think I'm hopeful that your takeaway is going to be your really good information, and I know we got the right guy for the job. So Ed, I'm going to turn it over to you, and we'll go from there.
Thanks, Bill. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on your time zone. So, as Bill said, my name is Ed Keck. I'm the partner and practice leader for the cyber and information security practice here at Witham. And Alexis, if you could just jump to the next slide. Let's just talk very briefly about what we're going to try and cover today. So we're going to talk about how cybercrime continues to grow. I want to talk about how you manage those risks, right? And how you handle a data breach. The value really of going beyond what's required to operate effectively in today's digital landscape, right? There's kind of the check the box, and then there's, what do you really need to do to take care of yourself and your clients? And then how do you apply data security best practices to maintain that good cyber hygiene at your firm? And then open it up for questions, because I'm quite sure that each of you probably has something on the top of your mind that you'd like to ask, and I want to make sure that we've allotted enough time for that. But looking forward to a good conversation. Please ask questions as we go. Alexis will grab those and we'll make sure that we answer them. Let's just get started. Alexis, if you can jump to the next slide for me. So when we talk about cybercrime continuing to grow, right? One of the research firms, Arctic Wolf, reviewed the top 11 cyber attacks at law firms, right? And some interesting things came out of that review. First of all, 4 of the 11 attacks involved ransomware, and we'll talk about how critical that can be in just a minute. But targeted hacking attacks happened in 2 of the 11 cases. These firms were specifically targeted based on the clients that they served, and we're seeing a lot more of this, okay? And then phishing was identified in 4 of the 11 attacks, and most likely also involved in the 4 ransomware attacks. Based on that, that's how we believe the ransomware actually got into the environment. So let's peel the onion back on these 3 for just a moment. The ransomware is problematic in 4 of the 11 cases because if you don't have an appropriate plan, you're actually out of the water. You may be unable to serve your clients for a period of time. And we're seeing this across not just law firms, but a number of different industries where, whether it's a medical practice, a law firm, various other organizations that either the hackers believe have a kind of a treasure trove of personal information, or are highly reliant on a digital infrastructure and they believe they can shut them down, they're going in with a ransomware attack. That ransomware attack is usually brought in through some phishing email. Somebody clicks on something, and then the next thing you know, the ransomware is in your environment. The first thing they do is they kind of enumerate the environment. What I mean by that is they scan your network and they say, what's out there? And then in a ransomware attack, they'll begin to encrypt all of your information and then tell you if you want that back or you want us to unlock it. By the way, that's, $500,000. It's $1 million, depending on what they think they can get away with. To be able to recover from that, you either have to pay the money and then hope that they give you the key and the key works, or you have to be able to go to a set of backups and be able to restore your information and know that the ransomware isn't there, right? Regardless, we are starting to see a significant number of firms, practices of varying types, where they are off the air for a period of time. And in one case, recently, there's been an entire hospital that has shut down because they were a target of a ransomware attack. They were unable to service patients for 14 days. And then it took them over 3 weeks to try and rebuild. And in that time frame, they've decided that they're not going to go back into business. They've gone bankrupt. I have other examples of practices in various areas, law firms, as well as medical practices, physician practices, where they've come very close to going out of business because they were unable to service clients. So ransomware is becoming a major problem, and it is becoming very targeted, and it's becoming much more prevalent. And the dollar amounts that the hackers are asking for have gone up 3- and 4-fold. The other thing we're seeing, as this slide says, is we're seeing targeted attacks against law firms that deal with high-profile clients or that deal with high amounts of personal information, where the hacker thinks they can gain information about specific individuals, or where they can gain, again, access to a treasure trove of personal information, bank accounts, things like that. So if you are in a space where you deal with high-profile clients, maybe you're in a space. I've spoken recently with a firm that works very closely with athletes, people in the entertainment industry that have had issues, and they help manage their reputation. Those firms are now being targeted because of the information they hold about such high-profile clients. And then phishing is as prevalent as ever. And really, it is people continue to be the weakest link, whether that's administrative people, whether it's people inside the practice themselves. People have a natural tendency to want to be helpful. We as human beings want to be helpful. We want to answer questions, right? And a phishing email or phishing attempts, they play on that emotion, and they try and get you to, click here because a senior member asked for something, or click here to quickly answer this survey, right? Or to help this customer potentially. And the next thing you know, there's software in your environment that's scanning your environment. So education and protection against phishing emails is still a significant element of any cybersecurity plan. But these are things that we continue to see grow, and we're seeing all of these attacks on the rise. They've practically quadrupled in the last year. Alexis, if we can jump again, that would be great. So just to kind of illustrate where we're at, right? In January of 2023, there was an article on law.com that law firm data breaches have grown significantly since the onset of COVID, right? So it's kind of the perfect storm. So not only law firms, but organizations of all types, people have now begun to work remote. That makes you more susceptible because your footprint is much bigger, right? So all the attack points that I have into an environment, if you have 200 employees, they now all work from home at some point. I now have 200 attack points. It could be their own personal Wi-Fi environment at home. It could be any number of things. iPads, phones have become much more prevalent. Unless those things are managed, they present an open environment. So in 2020, law firm breaches impacted 46,000 Americans from the data reviewed from 4 representative states. In 2021, that number escalated to over 720,000 Americans. Okay, so 720,000 people who are clients of various firms were now impacted by some type of breach that occurred at the firm itself. And that's just in 1 year. And those numbers continue to grow as we go into 2022 and 2023. They're still compiling the most recent ones, but with the attacks that have practically quadrupled, you can also assume that the exposure has grown dramatically as well. Next slide, Alexis. So, of these breaches, what are we really seeing, right? We can talk about different types of breaches. We can talk about very targeted attempts. But what are the real numbers, recent numbers? And one of the most reliable sources for these types of numbers is the Verizon data breach report. And what they're showing currently is that 83% of breaches involve external threat actors. Now, this is kind of a mixed bag or a dual-edged sword here, right? What this really means is that 83% of the time, the attack comes from the outside. But you'll also see that, a large part of this involves a human element of phishing, accidental insider misuse, things like that in the next number. But when you think about this also, that means it's 17% of the breaches. And when you think about 17% of all the events that occur, those are occurring from insider threats and from individuals that may either be disgruntled, it may be purposeful, but it also may just be misuse. It could be accidental, okay? So, we'll talk in a minute about it's not only important to protect yourself from the external elements, but it's also very important to understand internal behaviors and make sure that you're monitoring and addressing internal access and the potential for internal threats.
Can I ask a question? So
Absolutely.
If you have when you spoke earlier where you have people coming in where they're breaching, they're coming through iPads and other things that maybe other people are using at home because everybody's remote, what can some of these people do, or what are some of the maybe protocols they want to put in place at the firm to kind of limit that? So for example, I think at our firm, if you want to have access to certain things, there's certain stuff that has to go on there. Yep. So speak to that a little bit.
Sure, absolutely. So and we're going to talk about the controls as we go. But one of the biggest things here, Bill, is first of all, manage the device that is connecting to your environment. So the best thing I can tell firms, number one, is even if that device is personally owned. It's my phone, it's my iPad, right? If I'm going to use it to connect to the firm, whether that's a consulting firm, a law firm, whatever it might be, the firm should manage that device using a number of tools. And the one that, comes to mind initially, because a lot of organizations are Microsoft shops and you use the O365, the Office 365 suite, is Intune, right? But that allows you to put policies on the device that segregates the firm data from my personal data. It also dictates what you're allowed to access and how you're allowed to access it. And that type of management helps ensure, number one, that there's the right controls. You have pins locking your device. You have, you've kept it up to date with patching. You've done all of those things, okay? In addition to that, if I separate from the firm for any reason, the firm information can be taken away and not impact my personal data, right? Likewise, I can't take the firm data and move it somewhere without the firm being aware of it. The second thing is, when you're managing those devices, manage the access and what they can get to. And for people that are using laptops to get into the environment, strongly consider the use of a VPN, a virtual private network, so that connections are encrypted, and use multi-factor authentication to get into the environment. So those are some of the biggest items.
Would you say though, that so some of the people that the firm, the people that are on right now said that they're working with, if their provider or their cyber person hasn't mentioned any of these things, is that a red flag, or is that something that they as a result of this conversation, they go to them and say, hey, I was just on a seminar or a webinar, and this guy said, hey, I should be doing this, and that. I mean, is that a red flag?
It is, right? And you have to strike a balance between servicing your clients, accessibility to information, right? And securing that information, and making sure that it doesn't get outside of your environment. But that should be a red flag. Yes, if you haven't had these conversations with your internal IT team, your internal security people, or your managed provider that provides these services to you, that's a red flag, and you should be talking to them about it.
Okay, good. So when we were talking about, I mean, maybe you're going to talk about this later on, even if you get an assessment from somebody else, right? Even just to kind of check on the people that are working for you, is that something you do?
Yes.
Every year, every 5 years, every 3, like every quarter, like what's the best way? What's the best protocols for that?
Yeah, and I'll, if you don't mind, I'll talk about that maybe in a slide or two when we talk about some of the controls. But yes, you should, especially if you have an external provider that's managing your IT environment, or you're relying on external resources for that, you want to balance that with having another resource that actually provides you an independent opinion, and make sure that everything's in the right spot. So
Great.
I'll talk about that in just a minute. But then, 49% of these events include stolen credentials, and that's where we talk about, I'll talk a little bit more about this multi-factor authentication. It's one thing to have my password, but jumping between me and my phone, or being able to create a second set of credentials, takes it to a whole nother level that usually causes the hacker to go look somewhere else, right? It's usually that's way too much work, and very, very seldom do we see anything like that unless we're into what would be classified information, things like that we might work with. And then 95% of breaches are still motivated by financial gain, right? And what they're after is either that ransomware, give me a payment, I give you the key, you can have your information back. And ironically, there is some amount of honor amongst thieves, right? There's actually documented cases where the hacker got paid, the key didn't work, and they actually worked to get the data decrypted for the victim because they didn't want to be known as the hacker that didn't fulfill on their promise, right? Because then nobody would pay anymore. Okay, so ironically, there is some honor amongst thieves where if you pay them, they tend to give you the key, but those payments, as I said, have quadrupled kind of in size. It's not uncommon for that to be, especially if they believe they have their hands on some very good personal information, $500,000 or more that you have to pay. And there are times when cyber insurance specifically may or may not address that entire amount. Okay. And then the other way that they're motivated financially is, and we're seeing that in the targeted attacks really, is if they can get their hands on personal information, okay, especially for high profile individuals, and then sell that personal information on the dark web. There's literally, it's like going to Amazon. Okay, there are sites I can go to where I can order, 10 profiles. They're known as fulls, which means they have everything: name, address, social security number, phone number, the entire package, right? Or there's partials, right? I can buy names and phone numbers. I can buy name and social security number. The price goes up as they go from a partial to a full, okay? But they can be bought and traded on the dark web, just like you can go buy, you can have, a case of water delivered to your house, or, a new coffee table or whatever it might be from Amazon or any other site. There are places where you can literally just go click, 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 and buy 20, 10, whatever the number is. Go do whatever you want with those and then buy 10 more.
So
and that's
how do they know when that starts? Like, when does the firm know when that starts to happen? Like, do they get notified, or how does that happen?
Well, typically the firm would find the breach. They would, working with a forensics team like ours or another team, you would find that, oh, this is what was exfiltrated, right? You would see, oh, they transferred this much data out of the organization. Hopefully you can see exactly what they transferred. You would never know when the sale starts. It's very common that they grab the data, they let it sit for a short period of time, because then people kind of calm down, right? Because what'll happen is, regardless of whether it's a law firm or any other organization, you notify those people that, hey, your information has been collected, right? That it was part of a breach. Okay, we put credit monitoring in place. We do those things, right? People kind of get scared. They keep an eye on things for a month. Nothing happens. They go, okay, everything's okay. A month later, 2 months later, suddenly you start to see activity, and that's when those credentials are being sold, because they let them sit for a little while to let things calm down. And what I'll tell you is, especially if passwords are involved or things like that, most people are creatures of habit and they reuse passwords. Or if I get my hands on your challenge questions that might be in the clear, or think about all the places you go where they ask you those experience questions now, like which one of these cities did you ever live in, right? And they give you a list of 5 or 6 cities. Well, if I have your address, or I have a history of your addresses, I can now go answer that question on your behalf, right? It's 2 months later that we start to see those things being sold. That's the typical life cycle.
Okay, good.
So Alexis, go ahead and flip the slide for me. So what do you, let's start to talk about what you need to do about this, right? So how do you protect your firm? How do you manage these risks? Because it's really risk to you, risk to your client, risks to your reputation, risks to your ability to continue doing business. All of those things come into play, right? So first of all, you should have an annual risk assessment. You have to know what those risks are. And that risk assessment doesn't look the same for every law firm or every bank or every hospital or just because you're in the same industry doesn't mean the risk assessment is the same. For a law firm that has high profile clients or deals in personal injury or deals in certain types of legal services, those risks are going to look different than a law firm that focuses mostly on, corporate law, okay, or advising, corporations versus individuals. So you have to do a risk assessment. You have to know what data you have that could be at risk. You have to know how that data could be exposed, and you have to know what the risk is based on the industry you're in, but the niche that you're in that industry. So there is no cookie cutter. You really need to tailor this to your services and your organization. And that's something that you should do at a minimum on an annual basis. And then you construct your program around that, right? Along with that assessment and knowing what your risks really are, be aware of the threats that are related to your firm and your clients. So like the trends that I talked about up front, right? Know that we're starting to see targeted attacks. Know that phishing's on the rise. Know that the trends that are going on, and adjust your program to deal with those trends, right? So because phishing's on the rise or targeted attacks are on the rise, you may want to do extra education on a specific topic, or you may want to bolster, your multi-factor authentication, or you may want to make sure that your email filtering is tuned differently, okay? Or that you even have email filtering turned on. A lot of organizations, because sometimes it'll bounce real emails, they don't turn it on, or they kind of water down the filters. You want to pay attention to those trends along with your risks so that you balance that program appropriately and adjust it throughout the year.
So Ed, if you're a law firm and you have different groups within the law firm, like let's say you have your trust and estate area, you have a real estate area, corporate area, personal injury, whatever. So what you're saying is when you're going in to set up these assessments, depending on possibly the niche you're in, even let's say you're in entertainment and people are looking, for celebrities, or you're into, sports management and they're looking for sport, contract, like you gear all these different assessments differently depending on the activity of the particular client, correct?
Yes, absolutely. And those different areas of the firm in a large, diverse firm, excuse me, not even large, in a diverse firm, those risks are different from the entertainment practice than they are in the practice that maybe advises banks, okay, or deals with white collar crime, okay? Very, very different. The data is different. The way they interact with clients is going to be different. So you would tailor the security controls in that area differently. You would monitor different things. And that's where that assessment has to be tailored, not only to the firm, because you have to have that overall picture, but also to the individual practices if they're very diverse. So then you have to have a plan, right? So based on that, Bill, you have to have a plan that involves formal program, policies that cover your entire firm. You have to say what is acceptable use. How do you manage vulnerability and change, right? How often do you patch your environment? What do you have to do to change something in the environment? Changes should be approved. They should be reviewed. You have to manage risk and audit logs, okay? There should be someone in the firm who manages security should be reporting to the management team on a monthly basis, at a minimum on a quarterly basis. This is what we're seeing. This is what's going on. And the management team should be making decisions around how they adjust their program, what risks are acceptable, and what they want to do, right? Then also make sure you've got a business continuity and incident response that's part of your environment, and also exercise that process. So we do a lot of tabletop response exercises for firms, where we'll get the management team together either virtually or in a room, and we walk them through a scenario, right? Who are you going to call? Who's doing your forensics? You know, how are you going to respond in this scenario? Are you going to pay the ransom? Are you going to not pay the ransom? Do you have the right backups to pay the ransom or not pay the ransom? All those things need to be vetted so that when something does happen, you're not shooting from the hip. It's a well kind of oiled machine that you know, the process just kicks in, right? And then educate your people, right? And plan for any loss of effectiveness, you know, in the environment. That's part of that plan as well.
Are there any really hot areas right now that are out there that people that maybe on this call maybe say, hey, you know, here's a real hot area. If you're in this group, you probably want to be on the lookout or chat with somebody.
Yeah, I would say, you know, hot areas right now, ransomware, email filtering, and multi-factor are the controls that are hot. We'll talk about those a little bit more because of the attacks we're seeing. And then the biggest thing is, I can't tell you the number of firms, the number of practices across a wide range of disciplines that we have done tabletop exercises for, and you get to a point and they go, I don't know. Or, well, I think we should do this, but that doesn't result in the right end result, okay? Because as part of that exercise, if you do a couple a year, you find out, do I have the right insurance? Do I have the right, you know, do I have the right people on speed dial for, you know, to manage communications? Do I have the right decision tree, right? We've identified, well, I can't make that decision. You know, it has to be this person. Well, they're on vacation. Well, who makes that decision then? Or can we get a hold of them, right? What if we can't? Then who does make the decision, okay? Those things should be ironed out. It's never perfect, but the more you exercise that, it becomes kind of muscle memory, and you uncover those flaws and you're able to manage through them when you do have an event.
Yeah, so that there's at least a protocol in place. So
exactly, that's exactly it.
All right. Okay. Okay, good.
And Alexis, can you flip for me?
And again, for those who are on board, if you guys have any questions, if Ed has touched on something that struck a nerve with you, you know, we're more than happy to take your questions. So if you put them in the chat box, you know, you let us know. I have the chat box open. You know, I could always read it out to Ed. So if something has come across that you're that maybe you want to ask, you know, right now, you put it in there, and I'll make sure I get it to Ed.
And then, you know, we often look at regulation, and I want everyone to think of, from a cyber perspective, treating regulation as the minimum baseline, right? Because oftentimes just meeting the regs or meeting what's formally required doesn't get you to where you need to be, okay? What you really want to think of this as is, you want to think of the minimum security standards don't consider your organization's actual risks and the threats that come at you. They're concerned with protecting personal information, So that of your clients, right? So that baseline really doesn't get you to, I was still able to stay in business. I was still able to manage through the crisis. I was still able to manage my reputation. We were still able to service our clients. We were still able to keep going, right? Or better yet, it didn't happen and I stayed off the front page of the Wall Street Journal, right? The just meeting the reg doesn't get you there. That's why you need that risk assessment and to understand the individual businesses you're in and the threats that really can occur in those individual areas so that you address them, right? Because the number that I'll give you, and this is an interesting one, and it's kind of bore out over my 30+ year career. I've seen this, where to set up a program versus fixing it on the back end once something occurs is between the factor is between 6 and 10x. So if it costs you $100,000 to get a program in place and be in the right spot where you should be, considering your risks and a formal assessment and a formal program, typically, if you had a breach or if you had a negative event, it would be between $600,000 and $1 million to, first of all, recover from that event and then put the program in place that you needed to, that you should have had initially. So if you think about it, it's really much more cost effective, even though it seems like you're just spending money, right, on something that doesn't directly address a client need. It's much more cost effective to address security on the front end rather than the back end.
And when you're talking about different size firms, right? So where you're talking a smaller firm up to maybe an M or 200 firm, so to speak. It's and the larger the firm, I mean, I guess the best way to say this, does the scale of the cost go up based upon the size of the firm, or is it kind of like a cost and there's a base cost no matter what size firm you are, and then it jumps up, right?
Yeah, there are some things that aren't linear, right? So some things are, like if you said, well, I need 100 licenses of antivirus versus 2,000 licenses. Yeah, you get a volume discount, but that cost is kind of linear, right? It goes up. There are some things that, like doing a tabletop exercise, it's basically the same cost for us to do that for a large firm versus a smaller firm. We still need to get 4 to 10 execs in a room and run through a scenario, right? Writing your policies is kind of table stakes, right? So it's not all exponential. And really that hygiene part, getting those base things in place, once they're in place, then it's about maintenance versus, ongoing, escalating cost, right? And that's where if you get those base things in place, you can avoid a lot of that back end when an event happens, right? You'll respond more efficiently. You'll be able to quarantine it, stop it quicker, those types of things. That's why it's important.
So if you're doing the risk assessment, is there an assessment made of whether or not they have the basis in there on all the things right? So so if you go in and let's say you're in a smaller firm rather than a bigger firm, right? You say, hey, listen, you set up your plan, but it's a little like Swiss cheese. There's a bunch of holes here, right? Yeah. And this is what it's going to cost you to fill up your holes, right? And at that point, they have to make an assessment as to, hey, it cost me this much. Right. How much can I afford? Because quite frankly, the big thing that I envision when I come across a lot of these firms, right, especially the smaller firms, they want to protect their clients' information. Right, and they're responsible for it, right? But there's got to be. They also have to weigh the cost.
They do, right?
You know what I mean?
So that's a perfect, Bill. That's a perfect example of this is why you You want to, there is no cookie cutter here, right? And
Right.
I'll tell you, if I'm doing a program assessment for a 10-person firm or a 20-person firm versus a 2,000-person firm, there's a cost differential, right? You're looking at
Right.
more, the program's bigger, you have to assess more areas, right? But that's where you want to look for a provider that doesn't use a cookie cutter, okay? Because your firm, your organization, I don't care if it's a law firm, a bank, a hospital, a medical practice, whatever it might be, is unique, okay? And your approach has to be based on the size and complexity of what you do and the way you operate, right? And that's the way we approach it. There is no cookie cutter that says, oh, you need all of this. No, if you're 3 people and you know who's accessing everything, that looks a lot different than I have 20 practice areas and 2,000 people in the firm, and of the 2,000, 1,500 are lawyers and 500 are admin or whatever the mix is, right? That certainly looks a lot different, but what you're after is the right level of protection and the right level of governance. Governance and the tooling looks different based on those firms as well. And that's where what we do is when we do that assessment, we'll assess the program, we'll do a risk assessment. And what we do is we give you that roadmap, and a t-shirt size is the term I use to say, and what do we think this is going to cost, either in hours or dollars, right? What's the commitment level here? And we kind of say, the low-hanging fruit, the quick hits, the money well spent are here, here, and here. Do this first, right? And then think about this, okay? And it's always actionable. If you're not getting that, again, you asked for red flags. If you're not getting something that's actionable, if what you're getting is, well, you've got gaps, that's not helpful, okay? So if what you're getting from an assessor or from a provider is you've got gaps, you should fill these, without a plan, an actionable plan that says, and here's the ones we think that are going to be the biggest bang for the buck, it's a red flag. You should be talking to somebody.
So again, we're going back to, and I'm focused a little bit more on the smaller firms, because those are the ones that are probably need the assessments the most, in the sense that they probably have more of the gaps. And then there's the concern is how do they fill the gaps and the cost of the gaps. So whoever does the assessment, whether it's with them or somebody else who does the assessment, right? Whoever comes in and does their assessment annually should be able to sit down with them and say, here are the holes, and here's how you fill the holes, and here's the levels of the cost that it's going to take you to fill the holes, 20%, 50%, 80%, 100%, right? And so like someone like yourself or someone on your team, that you guys kind of walk through the firm as to, what level of risk and what's the cost and what's the cost benefit, or what you definitely need to have versus what, is more of a control, what'll help you sleep at night better.
Right. There's the must-haves, there's the should-haves, and there's the nice-to-have, right?
Right.
So Alexis, let's jump to the next slide. And Bill, I want to address a couple of things you were talking about, because you were talking about the smaller firms, right? There are going to be some firms that are using a third-party provider to manage their IT environment, right? Or it's a mix. They have some people internally, maybe that handle what I'll call the easy stuff, right? But they have a provider. What we're finding is that, and we've had a lot of inquiries lately, because we're in that space as well, as you know, Bill knows. A lot of those providers don't want to be a managed security provider in addition to being a managed IT provider because of the liability, right? With the response and things like that. So we actually do both, and we're seeing a lot of firms reach out, organizations, not just law firms, reach out and say, I have somebody, they do a great job, patching my systems and this, but I need somebody that monitors my threats and can quarantine a laptop if there's, a virus on it, right? If you're not having those discussions, it's not just about managed IT, it's about also managed security and that understanding those threats and what's coming at you as part of this as well, right? So if you're using a managed provider, talk to that provider about not just some of the things we're going to talk about on this slide, like patching your systems and things like that, but also about what happens if you have a breach. Can they respond? Do they monitor the dark web for you to tell you, we saw 20 of your email accounts out there this month? Anything like that. Those are things that a managed security service brings to the table that kind of layers on top of managed IT, right? But regardless of size, either internally or from your provider, you want to be looking at using multi-factor wherever you can, right? And think about areas where they say you can't. Why can't you? But use multi-factor for your VPN. Use multi-factor to get into your email if it's coming from a device that isn't your laptop, right? And that multi-factor can be, well, I have a trusted device because I'm using Intune or another management tool, and I know this is Ed's iPad, I know this is Ed's iPhone, but it's in a box, and I can control that information moving in and out. Last year, there were 721 million passwords that were leaked in 2022. Every account should have a unique password. Don't reuse them. Don't think that just changing the last character or adding a number makes it secure. Bill, stop laughing. You're giving away what you do for your password changes, right? But use a password manager. Okay, let it fill in a very complex password for you. Now, they're not perfect. Okay, we've seen compromises in the password managers as well, but they're certainly much better than using baseball 123 or the name of your favorite sports team or the city you grew up in or whatever it might be as the root of your password, because those are all socially engineerable things, right? All I got to do is be on one call and Bill goes, I love the Yankees, right? I'm making that up. I don't know if Bill loves the Yankees or not, but and suddenly if I ever saw, well, what's your favorite sports team? I go, the Yankees, right? Or it's Yankees 69 or the Mets, whatever, right? Using something to manage your passwords. First of all, our brains weren't designed to handle storing 500 things, right? It'll store them, it'll make them more secure. And if you layer multi-factor on top of that, it becomes a very, very strong way to keep people out of your environment. That's your system.
On my passwords, believe it or not, I like to make a little phrase, like whether it's from like a line from a song or something, just so that I'll remember that line. And it's not necessarily somebody's going to put two and two together that's the song I'm following, but I eliminate my kids' names, my wife's name, addresses and things like that, and I try to use because now you're up to like 15, 16 characters, right? So there's a little phrase that you can put in there, and you can figure out if you want. There's a specialty item
exactly. Where you substitute numbers. Yeah.
Correct.
We recently worked with a celebrity chef that had a breach in their environment. This individual has 5 or 6 high-profile restaurants, shows on a couple of different networks, and we worked with them. And they're doing something very similar now, where they have some favorite phrases that they use. That also works very well, right? Provide security awareness training. This is about the phishing, right? Also make sure that you have email filtering on the front end of your environment encrypt all your devices, all the laptops you issue. For the devices that are not yours, the personal devices that are brought, make sure you're managing that data, and that data, whether it's on my iPhone, my iPad, whatever, is secured, right? Train your employees about where they cannot store data. Flash drives are a great invention. They're also the easiest way to lose a ton of data, right? And then encrypt your data in transit, right? If you're moving data between yourself and your clients, yourself and other individuals that are assisting in a process, make sure that data is encrypted while it's being moved back and forth. If it's in the cloud, make sure it's encrypted in the cloud and manage that environment. These are some of this is basic cyber hygiene, and what I would say are table stakes, the things that everybody should be doing, whether you're large or small.
Excellent, excellent. So before we wrap up, because we're getting close to the end here. Again, if anybody has any questions, if you want to type them in the chat, I'm happy to do it. I'm happy to pass along the question to Ed. Ed, anything else out there that you could think of that maybe is a little bit that not exactly in your slides, but something that maybe maybe a cold cup of water being thrown in somebody's face to kind of say, hey, I didn't really think about that,
Yeah, the one thing that isn't in the slides that I would really encourage people to think about, because cyber monitoring, that's done beyond just IT management also includes your internal environment, right? Make sure you're keeping your logs for more than, by default, logs roll over every week in the cloud. You need 6 months worth of logs, okay, at a minimum, because if you find something, you have to be able to trace that back, okay? Also, don't ignore, people, internal behavior where people are maybe in the logs, you see repeated attempts to get to information, right? It's not common, but still remember 17 to 20% of all negative events are from internal sources, right? So part of any good security program is that internal monitoring. We recently had a situation where it wasn't one of the people directly in the practice, but it was someone in the administrative staff that had access to the back end that was walking out on a regular basis with tons of names, addresses, phone numbers, what you would find on the internet called a full, okay? They were printing them off and they were getting in the car and handing them to their significant other, who was then selling them to somebody.
Wow.
And
wow.
It was almost impossible to trace, right? But when it finally we looked at behavior and we were like, why is this person downloading all this data to their laptop? What's all this printing that's going on, like off hours or late? And we started to monitor the print jobs and capture them. And we found it was all personal information, and they actually watched them walk out the door and hand it to somebody one day.
Wow.
And then the cops pulled up and stopped them.
All right, we got 2 questions, okay? First question, can you provide your thoughts on using these automated risk assessment platforms versus a consulting firm, pros and cons?
So the pro is, you'll get a baseline and you'll be able to do it yourself. The con is it's not going to be tailored to you unless you know the right questions to ask. Where a firm that has experience in the space will tailor that risk assessment to you, and not only to you as an umbrella for the firm, but also understand, if you're a diverse firm, the practice areas and how they differ, right? So as we talked about, what does what does corporate law look like different than personal injury law, right? and what information is different, what risks are there, how would that be targeted differently? It's significant, the difference that you would get, because what you really want is you want that umbrella, but you also want to tailor it. You don't want to treat every area the same unless they should be treated the same.
All right, the second question, how do you get comfortable with sending and receiving emails that have sensitive information and everyone, including external associates, hates using encrypted mail?
So internally to the organization, that's where you manage the devices, right? And you create that sandbox using, and there's a number of tools that will do it, but that keeps corporate email out of my generic inbox on my iPhone or my Android device. It's not intermixed. I can't do things with it that you don't want me doing with it. That's number one. So internally, you manage that and you manage access. Externally, what I will tell you is if you have external associates that you trade information with on a regular basis, you can set up the encryption between the firms so that it's transparent to the individuals. So if you have organizations that you work with on a regular basis, set up the pipe between you to be encrypted versus forcing an encrypted email. That'll make life easier for everyone on each end. Unfortunately, for the one-off or the not so frequent emails, those you have to use encrypted email, or what you do is you send the email and you say, here's a site you can go to securely download the information. And then you have to have a secure site that they would log into or that. There's some different ways to do it, but those are the most common.
All right, here's the last question. What trends are you seeing in cyber or law firms that either have their own IT department or use IT managed services?
So that gets back to a little bit earlier, I was talking about the managed cyber piece of this, right? And the cyber coverage. What we're seeing is if you're a larger firm and you have your own IT staff, having someone, in that group that manages security, what we're seeing is a lot of do a security health check for us, help us with our risk assessment. And then that fills in the gaps of what tooling do we not have that we should have, what are leading practices that we should be doing. And we're seeing layering over constant monitoring on top of that, right? And then we're seeing very similar things for people who use, or firms that use a managed IT service. They're looking for do an external and an internal penetration test. Give me an opinion. They've told me my Wi-Fi is secure. They've told me my systems are patched. Verify that for me, first of all, so I know, am I really there? And then, excuse me, if that firm isn't covering all of the security pieces, including the ability to respond, layering over an additional security service to that to make sure that you've got all of the pieces covered. Those are kind of the trends we're seeing. What we're getting to is the point where you want someone monitoring the dark web for you. You want certain security practices in place, that you're getting threat and vulnerability reports on a quarterly basis at a minimum, but typically on a monthly basis. And the other thing we're seeing is we're starting to see executive cyber protection, where the key members of the firm, key members of management, we're looking at their home environments and at their personal environments to make sure that they're as secure as they can be. Those are some of the trends we're seeing now.
Well, Ed, I want to thank you for your discussion today. I hope that the people that were on the call, they found your information very useful. Alexis, what's the next steps here before we sign off?
Yeah, thank you, Bill and Ed. So each of you in the audience, you will receive a follow-up email from us. It'll include the recording of today's session as well as the slide deck that was presented.
Great. Well, I want to thank everybody for attending. I want to thank Ed, and hopefully you guys will enjoy the rest of your summer. And feel free to reach out to either myself or to Ed. We're happy to take a phone call. Wouldn't cost you a nickel. And we're happy to have a conversation with you and kind of walk you through any scenario that you may be facing at this time. So guys, have a great day, and thanks for being on board.
Thanks, everybody.